The lights in the hotel ballroom sparkled like stars, bouncing off the champagne glasses as the lively chatter filled the room. I stood by the entrance, my hand wrapped around a cool glass of champagne, trying to ease the tightness in my chest. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, one of those glamorous corporate events I had to attend as part of my job. The music was soft, the laughter light, and the atmosphere, at first glance, seemed perfect. But then I saw her. Kimmy. She was standing by the bar. Laughing, no, giggling, at something the guy next to her had said. His hand casually brushed her arm as he leaned in closer, whispering something that made her throw her head back in laughter. It wasn't the laugh she gave me. No, this was different, flirtatious. I felt a sharp knot twist in my gut. I watched them from across the room, my heart thudding uncomfortably in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting, seeing things that weren't there. After all, Kimmy and I had been married for 8 years. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but never had I doubted her. Not really. Not until tonight. The guy was tall, maybe a few years younger than me, with perfectly styled hair and an air of confidence that made me want to punch him in the face. He wasn't just some stranger offering her a casual compliment, he was working his way into something deeper. And the worst part? Kimmy wasn't pushing him away. I tightened my grip on the glass, watching as her hand lingered on his arm just a second too long. My stomach churned. My wife, the woman I had trusted with every part of me, was flirting with another man, right in front of me. I needed to pull myself together. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe she was just being friendly. After all, she was a social person, always had been. But that didn't explain the way she leaned into him, her body language screaming intimacy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I took a deep breath and forced myself to turn away. This wasn't the time or place for accusations, not in front of a crowd of people who had no idea what was going on inside my head. I needed to stay calm. I needed to be rational. But I couldn't stop glancing back at them, at the way her hand grazed his shoulder as she laughed again. My blood boiled. I needed air. Without a word to anyone, I slipped out of the ballroom and into the quiet hallway outside. The cool air hit my face, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside me. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over like some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize what I had just seen, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't deny the truth staring me in the face. Kimmy was crossing a line she had no business crossing. I didn't know how long I stood there in the hallway, leaning against the wall, trying to collect myself. Minutes felt like hours as I debated whether to confront her, to walk back into that ballroom and demand answers. But what good would that do? What if I was wrong? What if this was just a stupid misunderstanding, and I made a fool of myself? No, I needed to be smart about this. If there was one thing I knew, it was that Kimmy would never expect me to make a scene. She thought I was too calm, too rational for that. But tonight was different. I was different. And if she thought I would just let this slide, she was wrong. A slow, dark plan began to form in my mind as I stood there, staring at the ballroom doors. I wasn't going to argue with her, not here, not in private. No, that would be too easy. I wanted everyone to know. I wanted her to feel the humiliation I was feeling at this moment. I pushed off the wall, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. Tonight, it wouldn't just be another corporate party. Tonight, I was going to turn this celebration into a reckoning. And Kimmy would never see it coming. The moment I stepped back into the ballroom, I could feel the tension simmering beneath my skin. The elegant chandeliers still sparkled overhead, and the soft hum of laughter and clinking glasses filled the room, but none of it registered. My eyes were fixed on Kimmy and that man. They were still at the bar, and she hadn't moved an inch. She hadn't even noticed I was gone. I wove my way through the crowd, keeping my distance but watching them like a hawk. They weren't just having a casual conversation anymore. Kimmy's body language told me everything I needed to know. The way she leaned in when she spoke to him, the way her hand lightly grazed his arm. This wasn't friendly banter. She was crossing a line, and she didn't care who saw it. The worst part was, everyone here knew us. We were a fixture at these events, the couple everyone looked up to, the successful businessman and his charming wife. Kimmy loved the attention, loved being admired. And here she was, throwing it all away right in front of them. Right in front of me. I clenched my jaw and kept walking, trying to maintain control. I wasn't going to confront her here, not yet. That would be too easy. Too predictable. She expected me to do nothing, to stay calm like I always did. But tonight, I had something different in mind. From across the room, I watched as she laughed again, her hand lingering on the stranger's shoulder. My heart pounded in my chest, every fiber of my being telling me to march over there and end it. But I couldn't. Not yet. I moved to the back of the room, my fingers shaking slightly as I grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing tray. I needed to think, to plan. I wasn't going to lose control, not here. Not in front of all these people. I wanted something bigger, something that would make Kimmy realize just how badly she had screwed up. And then it happened. I saw her phone light up. She glanced at it briefly, and then, with a quick smile, she handed it to him. He looked at the screen, his lips curving into a smirk before he handed it back. My heart dropped into my stomach. That was it. She had given him her number. It wasn't just a flirtation anymore. It was real. She was planning something with him. Something that didn't involve me. I turned away, unable to watch anymore. My mind was spinning, rage and betrayal crashing over me like a wave. How could she do this? How could she stand there, so confident, so brazen, and throw our life away? I pushed through the crowd, my breath coming faster as I made my way to the event organizer. She was talking to one of the waitstaff, a clipboard in hand, but she turned when she saw me. "John, everything all right?" she asked, her smile genuine and professional. Yeah, everything's fine," I replied, forcing a smile. I was actually wondering if I could say a few words tonight. Just to thank everyone for coming. You know, nothing too long. Her eyes lit up. "Of course. You're one of our key sponsors, so I'm sure everyone would love to hear from you. I'll fit you in right after the CEO's speech." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Perfect. Thanks." As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I had about 15 minutes before I'd be handed the microphone. 15 minutes to figure out exactly what I was going to say. The plan was forming in my head, but I needed to be careful. This wasn't just about exposing Kimmy. It was about making sure everyone knew what kind of person she really was. I wasn't going to confront her in private, let her spin some story about how I was overreacting, or how it was all just a misunderstanding. No, this was going to be public. Very public. I glanced at Kimmy again. She was still at the bar, but now she was texting, probably arranging to meet him somewhere later. My blood boiled, but I kept my face neutral. I couldn't let her see that I knew. Not yet. The CEO's speech began, his voice echoing through the ballroom as he talked about the company's successes and the bright future ahead. I barely heard a word. My heart pounded in my chest, and every second felt like an eternity. But finally, he wrapped up, and the organizer signaled for me to take the stage. This was it. I straightened my jacket, took a deep breath, and made my way to the front. As I stepped onto the stage, the room quieted, hundreds of eyes turning toward me. I saw Kimmy look up from her phone, surprised, but not concerned. Not yet. I smiled as I took the microphone, my voice steady as I began to speak. "Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. It's been a fantastic evening, and I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be part of such an incredible team. We've had an amazing year, and I know the future is bright for all of us." I paused, glancing around the room. Kimmy was still watching me, smiling. She had no idea what was coming. But, I continued, "Before we wrap up, I want to talk about something a little more personal. You see, tonight's event has been enlightening for me in more ways than one." I looked directly at Kimmy. Her smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Many of you know my wife, Kimmy," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "She's been by my side for years, through thick and thin. But tonight, I've learned something new about her." The room was silent. Every eye was on me now. "I've learned," I said, my voice rising just a little, "that while I've been celebrating with all of you, my wife has been making other plans. Plans that don't include me." Kimmy's face went pale. She stood frozen by the bar, her phone clutched in her hand. "I just thought everyone should know," I continued, "that while we're all here tonight, enjoying each other's company, my wife has been sharing hers with someone else." I let the words hang in the air, the tension in the room so thick you could cut it with a knife. Kimmy's mouth opened, but no words came out. I looked her dead in the eyes. "Kimmy, I hope he's worth it." And with that, I handed the microphone back, turned on my heel, and walked off the stage. The moment I stepped off the stage, I could feel the weight of the silence behind me. The crowd was stunned. No one knew how to react to what I had just said. My heart was pounding in my chest, the adrenaline from the speech still coursing through me, but there was a strange sense of calm settling in too. I had done it. I had ripped the mask off and exposed everything. There was no going back now. As I made my way across the room, I could feel the stares. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. I glanced back once, just enough to see Kimmy still standing by the bar, her face ashen, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't moved an inch. The man she had been flirting with was gone, slipped away into the crowd the moment things turned ugly. Typical. Good. Let her stand there, let her feel what it's like to be left alone, to be exposed. I grabbed my coat from the rack near the entrance, barely noticing the familiar faces around me. Some of my colleagues, and friends even, were watching with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. They didn't know what to say, and I didn't care. I wasn't staying to listen to their pity or their questions. I was done with all of it. As I turned toward the exit, I heard her voice behind me. "John, wait, Kimmy." I stopped, my hand on the door, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see her face, didn't want to hear the lies that were sure to follow. "John, please," she said again, her voice shaking now. "Let's talk about this. Not here, please, can we go somewhere private?" I finally turned, slowly, my eyes meeting hers across the room. She looked desperate, her usually composed demeanor completely shattered. It was a look I'd never seen on her before, fear. Not the small, harmless kind, but real fear. The kind that comes when everything is slipping out of your control. I felt nothing. Not anger, not regret, not even satisfaction. Just emptiness. "Talk?" I said, my voice calm and steady. "Talk about what, Kimmy? What exactly do you think there is left to talk about?" She took a step toward me, her eyes darting around the room as if she was only now realizing how many people were watching. Her hands were trembling, and for a second, I saw the panic in her face as she struggled to come up with something, anything, that might make this go away. "John, it's not what you think," she began, her voice lowering as she reached me. He's a friend. We were just talking. I swear, it's not what it looked like." I let out a bitter laugh. "A friend? Is that why you gave him your number? Is that why you couldn't stop touching him all night? Because he's a friend, Kimmy?" She winced at my words, glancing down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. For a second, I thought she might actually cry. She never cried. Kimmy was always the one in control, always the one who kept her cool in any situation. But now, standing here in front of me, she looked like she was on the verge of breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, barely audible. I don't know what happened. It was stupid. It didn't mean anything." I shook my head, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through me. "It didn't mean anything? Really? Then why did you do it, Kimmy? Why would you risk everything for something that didn't mean anything?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She didn't have an answer. Of course, she didn't. There wasn't one. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady, even as the emotions I had been holding back all night threatened to rise to the surface. "You didn't just make a mistake, Kimmy. You made a choice. You chose him. You chose to disrespect me, to humiliate me in front of everyone we know." Tears welled up in her eyes now, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "I couldn't. Not anymore. I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, her voice cracking. "But you did," I replied coldly. "You hurt me, and now you're paying the price." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was deafening, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for far too long. All the cracks in our marriage, all the things we had ignored or brushed aside, had finally shattered into pieces. There was no fixing it now. "I don't know what to say," Kimmy whispered, her voice barely holding together. "Please, John, just give me a chance to make this right." I stared at her, wondering if she actually believed there was still something to salvage. How could she? How could she look at me after everything she'd done and think that there was still hope? "There's nothing to fix," I said quietly. "It's too late." I turned my back on her and walked out the door, leaving her standing there in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by people who had seen everything but understood nothing. As the cold night air hit my face, I felt a strange sense of relief. The weight I had been carrying for months, maybe even years, was finally gone. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know how my life was going to change after tonight, or what the fallout would be. But one thing was certain. I was done with Kimmy. Done with the lies, the games, the betrayal. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stepped out of the hotel, leaving the chaos of the ballroom behind me. The streets were empty, save for a few cars passing by and the occasional pedestrian. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from the outside. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go or what to do next. It wasn't like I had planned for this. Not the way things had spiraled so quickly, so completely. I had imagined the confrontation with Kimmy, but I hadn't thought beyond that moment. Now, all I had was the aftermath, the broken pieces of our life together scattered at my feet. I could still feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins, my heart pounding as I replayed everything in my mind. The speech, Kimmy's face when I exposed her, the quiet devastation in her eyes when I walked away. For a second, I almost regretted it. Almost. But then I reminded myself of what she had done. The way she had humiliated me. The way she had betrayed my trust so casually, so effortlessly, like it meant nothing. I wasn't going to let her turn this into something I should feel guilty about. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, half expecting it to be Kimmy, but it wasn't. It was a text from Ryan, one of my closest friends. He must have heard about what happened. The message was short and to the point. You okay? Call me if you need anything. I stared at the message for a moment, debating whether or not to respond. Ryan had always been there for me, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and started walking, my mind still racing with everything that had just happened. The streets were quiet, the sounds of the city muffled in the night. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to keep moving. I couldn't just stand there, not with the anger and confusion still boiling inside me. I needed space, time to think, and time to figure out what came next. I found myself heading toward the park, a place I had always gone to clear my head. It was late, and the park was mostly deserted, the lampposts casting long shadows over the pathways. I sat down on one of the benches, staring out at the darkened trees, my mind still whirling. What was I supposed to do now? I had blown up my marriage in front of a room full of people. There was no taking that back, no undoing the damage. Everyone knew. By tomorrow, the story would be all over town, circulating through the gossip mill until it reached every corner of our lives. For a second, I considered what would happen if I hadn't said anything. If I had just confronted Kimmy privately, talked things through, and given her a chance to explain herself. Maybe we could have salvaged something, avoided the spectacle. But then I thought about the look on her face when she was standing at the bar with that guy, laughing. Flirting, completely oblivious to the wreckage she was causing. No, this had been the right thing to do. She needed to feel the weight of her choices, just like I had. My phone buzzed again. Another message, but this time it was from Kimmy. John, please, can we talk? Just the two of us. Please. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the message. A part of me wanted to respond, to see if there was anything she could say that would make sense of it all. But I knew better. This wasn't about making sense of it. It was about consequences. About facing the reality of what had happened and moving forward, whatever that meant. I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket, leaning back against the bench. Kimmy could wait. Whatever she had to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. As I sat there in the quiet of the park, the weight of the situation started to settle in. My life, the life I had built with Kimmy, was over. The house, the friends, the routines we had created together, it all felt like it belonged to someone else now. Someone who didn't exist anymore. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the thoughts, the regrets, the questions. But they kept coming. Had I missed the signs? Had I been blind to what was happening right in front of me? Maybe there were clues, small moments of disconnection, little things that had changed between us over the years. But I had ignored them, convinced myself that everything was fine, that we were solid. That we were still us. But we weren't. Not for a long time, it seemed. The wind rustled through the trees, and I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the distance. It was strange, sitting here in the middle of the night, knowing that everything was different now, but feeling like nothing had changed. The world kept turning, indifferent to my personal disaster. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. At some point, I would have to deal with the fallout, face Kimmy, and figure out what to do next. But for now, I just needed to breathe. To sit in the quiet and let the weight of it all sink in. I thought about the future, what it would look like without her. I hadn't imagined a life where Kimmy wasn't by my side. Even with all the issues we had, I never thought it would come to this. But now, the reality of that future was starting to take shape, and it scared me. I wasn't sure who I was without her. The sound of footsteps on the path pulled me out of my thoughts. I glanced up and saw an older man walking his dog, nodding at me as he passed by. It was such a normal, mundane moment, and for some reason, it made me feel even more disconnected from everything. How could the world keep going like nothing had happened? I stayed there on the bench for a long time, the minutes blending into hours. Eventually, I knew I had to get up, had to leave the park, and figure out where to go next. Home? To a friend's place? Anywhere but back to that hotel where Kimmy was probably waiting, hoping I would come back and talk to her. But I wasn't ready for that yet. I wasn't ready to face her, to hear her excuses, or worse, her apologies. With a deep breath, I stood up and started walking again, unsure of where my feet would take me, but knowing that wherever it was, it would be far from Kimmy. Far from the life I thought I knew. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what I needed. The next morning felt like waking up in the aftermath of a storm. My head pounded, and the weight of what had happened the night before was like a heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. I had spent the night at Ryan's place after finally texting him back, not wanting to return to the house I shared with Kimmy. Ryan had been great, as always, didn't push me to talk, just handed me a drink and let me crash in his spare room. Now, as the sun streamed through the blinds, the full weight of everything settled in my chest like a stone. I had to go back eventually. I had to face Kimmy. I dragged myself out of bed, threw on some clothes, and thanked Ryan on my way out. He gave me a nod. The kind that said he'd be there if I needed him, but he knew I had to do this alone. The drive back home felt longer than usual, my mind replaying the events of the night before in an endless loop. My hands gripped the steering wheel, every muscle in my body tense. Part of me still couldn't believe I had done it, called Kimmy out in front of everyone, exposing her for what she had done. But another part of me knew it had been inevitable. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car parked in its usual spot. She was home. I sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It looked the same as it always had, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. Not after last night. I wondered if Kimmy had spent the night inside, if she had stayed up waiting for me, or if she had left and come back like I had. With a deep breath, I finally got out of the car and walked up to the front door. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob before I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. For a moment, I thought maybe she wasn't home after all, but then I heard the faint sound of footsteps from the kitchen. Kimmy appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She had been crying. Her usual composed, polished appearance was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. She looked fragile, like a version of Kimmy that had never existed in my mind. "John," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "You came back." I didn't respond right away, just stood there, staring at her. The anger I had felt last night had settled into something colder, something heavier. I wasn't here to fight anymore. I was here to figure out what came next. "We need to talk," I said, my voice flat. She nodded, wiping at her eyes, but didn't say anything as she moved aside to let me into the kitchen. I sat down at the table, the same table where we had shared 1,000 dinners, where we had laughed and talked about our days. Now, it felt like a stranger's house. Kimmy sat across from me, her hands twisting together nervously. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us thick with tension. "I know I messed up," she finally said, her voice trembling. "What I did, it was wrong. I don't even know why I did it. You don't know why?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "You were flirting with him all night, Kimmy. You gave him your number. That's not something you just do by accident." She winced at my words, tears filling her eyes again. I know it wasn't an accident. I've been feeling so disconnected from everything. From us. I don't know when it started, but it's like we've been drifting apart, and I didn't know how to stop it." I stared at her, the coldness inside me hardening further. "So you thought flirting with some stranger at a party would fix that? You thought betraying me was the answer?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It wasn't like that. I wasn't thinking straight, John. I was stupid, and I got caught up in the moment, but it didn't mean anything. I swear to you, nothing happened beyond what you saw. I never would have Stop, I said, cutting her off again. I don't care what you would have done or what you didn't do. You crossed a line, Kimmy. And you didn't care about how it would affect me or our marriage. She looked down at the table, her hands trembling in her lap. I don't know what to say to make this right. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. There's nothing you can say. You broke something, Kimmy. And I don't know if it can be fixed. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those words hanging in the air between us. I didn't know if I wanted to fix it. Part of me just wanted to walk out and never look back. But another part, the part that still remembered the good times, the love we had shared, wasn't ready to give up entirely. Not yet. I need space, I finally said. I don't know what happens next, but I need time to think. Kimmy nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. I understand. I stood up, feeling the urge to leave again, to get away from the tension and the memories that filled every corner of the house. I'm going to stay at Ryan's for a while. I'll let you know when I'm ready to talk more. She nodded again, not saying anything as I walked out of the kitchen and headed for the door. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look back. As I stepped outside, the weight on my chest eased just a little. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, I had taken the first step. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and isolation. I spent most of my time at Ryan's, who gave me space but made sure to check in every now and then. I appreciated the silence, the chance to breathe without Kimmy's presence hovering over me. It gave me time to think, but also time to feel the ache of everything that had happened. I hadn't heard from Kimmy since that morning at the house. She was giving me the space I had asked for, and I couldn't tell if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Part of me wanted her to fight for us, to prove that she cared enough to try. But another part of me knew that nothing she did would erase the betrayal I had felt. One night, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at my phone. I had been avoiding social media, not wanting to see the inevitable gossip that had spread after the scene at the hotel. But curiosity got the better of me, and I opened my messages, scrolling through the dozens of unread texts from friends, acquaintances, and even colleagues. Most of them were the same, messages of shock, sympathy, or vague attempts to offer support. But one message stood out, one I hadn't expected. It was from Kimmy's sister, Lauren. John, I don't know what happened between you two, but Kimmy's been a mess. I've never seen her like this. She won't talk to me about it, but if you're ready, I think she needs to hear from you. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. Lauren had always been close to Kimmy, but we had never been particularly close ourselves. The fact that she was reaching out to me meant something. It meant Kimmy was hurting. For the first time since everything had happened, I felt a flicker of guilt. I had been so focused on my own pain, my own anger, that I hadn't considered how this was affecting her. I didn't know if that changed anything, but it was enough to make me pause. I sat there for a long time, thinking about what Lauren had said. Thinking about Kimmy, about the life we had built together, and about whether it was worth trying to salvage. Finally, I picked up my phone and typed out a message to Kimmy. We need to talk. Let's meet tomorrow. I hit send, my heart heavy with the weight of the decision I had just made. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure: it was time to stop running. It was time to face the future, whether that meant rebuilding what was broken or walking away for good. The morning of the meeting felt like the calm before a storm. The tension was thick in the air, and I could feel it pressing down on me as I left Ryan's place. The message I had sent to Kimmy the night before had been short and to the point, and she had agreed to meet without hesitation. Now, as I drove toward the cafe where we had decided to talk, my mind was filled with doubts and questions. What was I expecting to happen? Was this meeting about closure, or was there a part of me that wanted to find a way back to her? I couldn't even answer that for myself. When I pulled up outside the small cafe on the edge of town, I spotted Kimmy's car already parked out front. She had gotten here early. That was typical of her, always prepared, always punctual. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the entrance, trying to gather my thoughts. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped out and headed inside. Kimmy was sitting at a small table near the window, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked up as I walked in, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, maybe hope, maybe regret. It was hard to tell. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and her makeup was minimal. For the first time in a long time, she looked vulnerable. John, she said softly as I approached the table. Thanks for coming. I nodded, sitting down across from her. The tension between us was palpable, and I wasn't sure how to start. What was there to say after everything that had happened? For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The cafe was quiet, with only a few other customers scattered around, and the soft hum of conversation in the background. I could hear the clink of cups and the faint hiss of the espresso machine, but it all felt distant, like we were in our own bubble of unresolved tension. Finally, Kimmy broke the silence. I've been thinking a lot about everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. About what I did, and how much I hurt you. I stared at her, waiting for her to continue. Part of me wanted to hear her explanation, but another part of me wasn't sure if it mattered anymore. I don't know why I let things get so bad, she continued. I've been so lost, John. I didn't realize how disconnected I'd become from you, from us. And when I saw that guy at the party, I guess I was looking for something to make me feel, I don't know, alive again. Her words stung, but they also felt honest in a way that I hadn't expected. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret. I'm not trying to make excuses, she said quickly, sensing my reaction. There's no excuse for what I did. I know I broke your trust, and I know that's not something you can just forget. I let out a slow breath, trying to find the right words. No, it's not something I can forget. You crossed a line, Kimmy. And I don't know if we can come back from that. She nodded, biting her lip. I know. But I want to try. I still love you, John. I don't want to lose you. Her words hung in the air between us. And for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me had been bracing for this, for her to ask for forgiveness, but hearing it out loud felt different. It brought all the old emotions rushing back, anger, hurt, love, and confusion, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untie. I don't know if love is enough anymore, I said finally, my voice quiet. You say you love me, but you were willing to throw it all away for a moment of excitement. How am I supposed to trust you again after that? Kimmy's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I don't know, she whispered. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that trust back if you'll give me the chance. I looked down at my hands, trying to process everything. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that we could somehow find our way back to what we had before. But the betrayal still cut deep, and I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way again. I need time, I said finally. I need to figure out if I can forgive you, if I can trust you again. Right now, I don't know if I can. Kimmy nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I understand. I'll give you as much time as you need. We sat there in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what else to say. The cafe buzzed with quiet activity around us, but it felt like we were the only two people in the world, caught in this moment of uncertainty. After what felt like an eternity, I stood up, breaking the spell. I'll be in touch, I said, my voice distant. But for now, I think we both need space. Kimmy looked up at me, her expression filled with a mix of sadness and acceptance. Okay, she whispered. I turned and walked out of the cafe, the cool air hitting my face as I stepped outside. My mind was spinning, and I wasn't sure what the future held. But one thing was certain, this wasn't going to be an easy road. Days turned into weeks. I kept myself busy, throwing myself into work and spending time with friends, trying to avoid the gnawing emptiness that came from the limbo I was stuck in. Kimmy had given me the space I asked for, and for a while, that had been enough. But as the weeks passed, the silence between us grew heavier, and I knew I couldn't avoid the inevitable forever. I had to make a decision. One evening, after a long day at the office, I found myself sitting in my apartment, staring at the framed photos on the wall. Most of them were of Kimmy and me, smiling, laughing, holding each other close. They were snapshots of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. A life that I wasn't sure I could ever go back to. I picked up one of the frames, a picture of the two of us from our honeymoon. We were standing on the beach, the sun setting behind us, her head resting on my shoulder. We looked happy and content. But that happiness felt like a distant memory now, overshadowed by everything that had happened since. A part of me missed her. I missed the Kimmy I had fallen in love with, the woman who had been my partner, my confidant. But another part of me couldn't shake the image of her at the hotel. Flirting with that stranger, betraying the trust we had built over the years. Could I really forgive her? Could I let go of the anger and hurt that had consumed me since that night? I put the picture down, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't keep running from the decision. It wasn't fair to Kimmy, and it wasn't fair to myself. I had to figure out what I wanted, whether that meant trying to rebuild what was broken or walking away for good. The next day, I made up my mind. I called Kimmy and asked her to meet me. This time, we met at the house we had shared, the house that held so many memories, both good and bad. It felt fitting, in a way, to have this conversation here, in the place where everything had started. When I arrived, Kimmy was already there, sitting on the porch steps. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mix of nervousness and hope. "John," she said quietly as I sat down next to her. "I've been waiting for you." I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was about to say. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "About us, about everything that's happened." Kimmy nodded, her hands fidgeting in her lap. And I don't know if we can go back to the way things were," I continued. "But I don't want to walk away without giving us a chance to try." Her eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. "You mean?" I'm willing to try," I said, meeting her gaze. "But it's not going to be easy. It's going to take time, and we're going to have to rebuild a lot of trust." Kimmy's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of relief. "I know. And I'll do whatever it takes, John. I promise." I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision lift just a little. "One step at a time," I said. She smiled through her tears, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to smile back. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for now, we had a starting point. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Rebuilding something that's been broken isn't like fixing a shattered vase. You can't just glue the pieces back together and pretend it was never broken. The cracks remain, no matter how carefully you try to patch things up. And that's exactly what it felt like with Kimmy in the weeks that followed our conversation on the porch. We didn't move back in together right away. I was still staying at Ryan's place, though I visited the house more often now. It felt strange to be there again, like stepping into an old life that no longer fit. But we were trying, and that counted for something. Kimmy had started seeing a therapist, and I decided to do the same. We needed help navigating the mess we had created. If we were going to make this work, we couldn't just ignore the cracks and hope they'd heal on their own. We needed to talk about what had happened, about why she had drifted away, and why I hadn't noticed until it was too late. Our first few conversations were hard. There was so much raw emotion between us, anger, regret, shame, and sometimes, it felt like we were walking on eggshells. But we kept showing up for each other, even when it was uncomfortable. We had agreed that honesty was the only way forward, even if it hurt. One evening, we sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd had our last fight, and Kimmy finally opened up about what had been going on in her head before that night at the hotel. "I felt like I was drowning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just in our marriage but in everything. Work, life. I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt like I'd lost myself somewhere along the way, and I was scared." I listened in silence, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to be angry, to yell and ask why she hadn't told me all of this sooner. But the other part of me, the part that still loved her, knew that anger wouldn't help. "I didn't want to burden you," she continued, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I thought if I could just keep going, keep pretending everything was fine, it would all work itself out. But then, at that party, I don't know, John. Something inside me snapped. I just wanted to feel something different, even if it was for a moment." Her voice cracked, and she looked down at her hands, ashamed. I reached across the table and took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently. "I wish you had told me sooner," I said quietly. "I could have helped you. We could have figured this out together." "I know," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "But I didn't know how. And by the time I realized how bad things had gotten, it was too late." We sat there for a while, holding hands in the quiet kitchen. The weight of her words hung between us, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. We were finally talking about the things that had gone unsaid for too long. "I'm scared, John," she admitted after a long pause. "I'm scared I've ruined everything." "I am too," I replied honestly. "But we can't change what's already happened. All we can do is try to move forward." Kimmy nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Do you think we'll be okay? Really okay?" "I don't know," I said. "But I'm willing to try." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the truth. Rebuilding trust wasn't something that could be rushed, and we both knew it. There would be setbacks and moments of doubt. But as long as we were both willing to put in the effort, I believed we had a chance. A month passed, and things were slowly starting to settle into a new normal. I had moved back into the house, though I kept a little bit of distance, sleeping in the guest room most nights. We were giving each other space while still working on reconnecting. It wasn't always easy, but we were making progress. But then came the first real test of our fragile peace. It was a Saturday night, and we had decided to go out for dinner, something we hadn't done together since before everything had fallen apart. It felt like a step in the right direction, a chance to remind ourselves of what we had once enjoyed about each other's company. The restaurant was cozy, the kind of place we used to love: dim lighting, soft music, and an atmosphere that made it easy to relax. For the first time in a while, we actually laughed together. We talked about work, about our families, about random little things that had nothing to do with the mess we were still trying to clean up. For a moment, I almost felt like we were us again. But then, as we were finishing dessert, I saw him. Sitting at the bar, with a drink in hand and a smug smile on his face, was the guy from the hotel, the one Kimmy had flirted with. I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth, my stomach churning. He hadn't seen us yet, but the mere sight of him was enough to bring all the old feelings rushing back. The anger, the betrayal. Kimmy noticed the change in my expression and followed my gaze. When she saw him, her face paled, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "John," she said softly, reaching across the table for my hand. "Please don't do this." But it was too late. The anger was already bubbling up inside me, threatening to spill over. I stood up from the table, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to do: confront him, maybe, or just walk out, but I couldn't sit there any longer. Kimmy grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "Please, John, don't let him ruin this. We're having a good night. Don't let him take that away from us." I stopped, her words cutting through the fog of rage that had clouded my mind. She was right. This wasn't about him. This was about us, about whether we were strong enough to move past what had happened. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. The guy at the bar didn't matter. What mattered was how I reacted, and how we handled this together. I looked down at Kimmy, her eyes pleading with me to let it go. And for the first time since that night at the hotel, I realized that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Not to that guy, not to the world, and not even to myself. The only thing that mattered was the choice I was making at that moment: to focus on Kimmy, on us, and not let the past dictate our future. Slowly, I sat back down, my heart still racing but my mind a little clearer. Kimmy let out a shaky breath of relief and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes filled with gratitude. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. But as I sat there, I realized that this was the first real test of our new beginning. And while it hadn't been easy, we had passed. We had chosen each other over the pain, over the anger, over the past. It wasn't the end of our struggles. There would be more moments like this, more tests of our commitment to each other. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a fighting chance. As we left the restaurant, I glanced one last time at the guy at the bar. He was still there, oblivious to the storm he had stirred up. But as I walked out with Kimmy's hand in mine, I realized that it didn't matter anymore. We were moving forward, one step at a time. And that was enough. Things were going well, or so I thought. After that night at the restaurant, something shifted between Kimmy and me. We started spending more time together, doing the small things that had once made our relationship strong. Walks in the park, cooking dinner together, talking late into the night. It felt like we were finally making real progress. But then came the setback. And, honestly, I should have seen it coming. One afternoon, while I was at work, I got a message from Kimmy. It was short and vague, just a simple, "We need to talk." My stomach knotted immediately. That's never a good sign. When I got home that evening, Kimmy was waiting for me in the living room. She was pacing back and forth, her face pale, like she was trying to figure out how to say whatever it was that had been eating at her. I dropped my keys on the table and walked toward her. "What's going on?" She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes full of a mixture of guilt and fear. "I need to tell you something. I didn't want to keep it from you, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up." I could feel my chest tighten. "What is it?" She hesitated for a moment, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "He texted me." For a second, I didn't register what she had said. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. What? The guy from the hotel, she clarified, her voice trembling. He texted me. I don't know how he got my number, but he sent me a message. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold wave of anger washing over me. And when were you planning on telling me this? I didn't respond, she said quickly. I deleted it right away. But I didn't want to keep it a secret. I thought you should know. I couldn't believe this was happening. After everything we'd been through, after everything we were trying to rebuild, this guy was still lurking in the background, trying to wedge himself between us. My hands clenched into fists, and I could feel the familiar anger bubbling up inside me, the same anger that had nearly consumed me at the restaurant. Why didn't you block him? I snapped, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. I didn't think I needed to, Kimmy said softly, tears filling her eyes. I thought deleting the message was enough. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, trying to get a grip on my emotions. This wasn't her fault, I told myself. She hadn't asked for this. But the fact that this guy still thought he could reach out to her, still thought he had a chance to worm his way into our lives, made my blood boil. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't want to upset you. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. The rational part of me knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She had been honest with me, and that was more than I could have asked for. But the irrational part of me, the part that still felt the sting of betrayal, couldn't shake the anger. We need to block him, I said finally, my voice cold. Now, Kimmy nodded, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. I stood by her side, watching as she scrolled through her contacts and blocked the number. It wasn't enough to erase the anger I felt, but it was a start. Once she was done, she looked up at me, her eyes full of guilt and uncertainty. I didn't want to hide it from you. I just didn't know how to tell you without making things worse. I sighed, the tension still heavy between us. You did the right thing by telling me. But this is a setback, Kimmy. I'm not going to lie. It hurts that this guy still thinks he can reach out to you. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. I know, and I hate that it happened. But I'm committed to us, John. I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But trust wasn't something that came easy after everything we had been through. And this was a reminder that we weren't out of the woods yet. I know you do, I said, my voice softening. But we need to be honest with each other about everything. No more secrets, no more hiding things. That's the only way this is going to work. Kimmy nodded, a small flicker of hope in her eyes. I promise. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and the anger still simmered beneath the surface, but at least we had faced this together. And that was more than we could say for a lot of couples in our situation. The next few weeks were tense. The incident with the message had left a lingering sense of unease between us. We were still trying, but now there was a shadow hanging over everything. It felt like we were constantly walking a tightrope, careful not to upset the fragile balance we had managed to create. But I wasn't ready to give up. Despite everything, I still loved Kimmy. And I knew that if we were going to get through this, we needed to take the next step. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home and found Kimmy sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine. She looked up as I walked in, a small smile playing on her lips, but I could tell there was something on her mind. Hey, I said, dropping my bag by the door. You okay? She nodded, though I could see the tension in her posture. Yeah, I've just been thinking about us. About what comes next. I sat down beside her, trying to gauge her mood. What do you mean? Kimmy sighed, setting the magazine aside and turning to face me. I feel like we've been in this weird limbo for a while now. We're trying to fix things, but we're still living in this in-between space. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like we're stuck. I knew what she meant. Even though we had been working through our issues, it still felt like we were holding something back, like we hadn't fully committed to moving forward. We were both still afraid of getting hurt again. So what are you saying? I asked, unsure of where this was going. Kimmy took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. I think we need to take the next step. I think we need to move back into the same room. Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. We had been sleeping in separate rooms ever since I moved back into the house. It had been a way to give each other space, to figure out if we could rebuild the trust that had been broken. And now she was asking to close that distance, to move forward in a way that scared me. I know it's a big step, she said quickly, sensing my hesitation. And if you're not ready, that's okay. But I think we need to try. Otherwise, we're just going to keep spinning our wheels. I looked at her, the woman I had fallen in love with, the woman who had hurt me more deeply than anyone else ever had. And yet, despite everything, I still wanted her. I still wanted us to work. I don't know if I'm ready, I admitted, my voice low. But maybe it's time to try. Kimmy's face lit up with a mix of relief and hope, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small flicker of optimism. We both knew this wasn't a magic fix. Sharing a room again wouldn't erase the hurt or rebuild the trust overnight. But it was a step, and right now, that was what we needed, a tangible step forward. That night, for the first time in months, we slept in the same bed. It was awkward at first, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fears and doubts. But as the night wore on, the tension began to ease. Slowly and cautiously, we reached for each other. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Our anniversary was approaching. A day that once filled me with excitement was now tinged with uncertainty. In the past, Kimmy and I had always celebrated in a big way. Dinner at our favorite restaurant, a surprise weekend getaway, or a thoughtful gift exchanged over candlelight. But this year felt different. How do you celebrate an anniversary when everything has been shaken to its core? Despite the lingering tension, I wanted to make an effort. If we were truly trying to rebuild, then maybe this day could serve as a reminder of the good things we still had, the reasons we fell in love in the first place. It didn't have to be grand or extravagant, but it needed to be something that would bring us closer, not push us further apart. Kimmy had been quiet in the days leading up to it, almost as if she wasn't sure how to approach the topic either. The elephant in the room loomed larger every day, and neither of us had mentioned any plans. The night before our anniversary, we were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless TV show. The silence between us was comfortable enough, but there was still a distance that we hadn't yet bridged. Finally, I cleared my throat, nervous about how she would react to what I was about to say. "So, tomorrow's our anniversary," I began cautiously. She looked over at me, her expression unreadable. "Yeah, I know," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. I was thinking, maybe we could do something together, I suggested. It doesn't have to be anything big. We could just have dinner, spend some time together, like old times. Kimmy's lips curled into a small, hesitant smile. "I'd like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about it too, but I didn't want to push you." I nodded, relieved that she was open to the idea. We're both trying, right? Maybe we can use this day to remember why we're doing all of this. She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I want that. I want to remember the good times. I miss them." There was a softness in her voice, a vulnerability that reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. For the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe we could recapture some of what we had lost. The next day, I made a reservation at one of our old favorite spots, a little Italian place tucked away in the corner of downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it held memories. I hoped it would be enough to help us reconnect. When Kimmy and I arrived, the atmosphere was perfect. Dim lighting, soft music, and the familiar smell of garlic and wine. It felt comforting, like a safe space for us to try and heal some of the wounds that still lingered between us. We ordered wine and pasta, and for the first time in months, we talked. Really talked. Not about the mess we'd been through or the pain we were trying to navigate, but about the good times. We reminisced about our early days together, the time we took a spontaneous road trip to the beach, the awkward but sweet first date, and the time we got lost in the city and ended up laughing so hard we cried. For a little while, it felt like we were us again. Like the cracks hadn't formed, and we were still the couple we had once been. As dessert arrived, a shared tiramisu, just like we used to do, Kimmy looked at me with a mix of love and sadness in her eyes. "I want to believe that we can get back to this," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "But sometimes, I'm so scared that it's too late." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew exactly what she meant. We were trying, but the fear of failure loomed over every step we took. What if this wasn't enough? What if we were just delaying the inevitable? But I couldn't let that fear control me. Not tonight. Not when we were finally starting to feel like ourselves again. "I'm scared too," I admitted, my voice steady but honest. "But we've come this far. We're still here, still trying. That has to count for something. Kimmy nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, smiling through the emotion. It does. It means everything. We finished the tiramisu in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was one filled with the weight of everything we had been through, but also with the possibility of what could come next. Maybe we weren't fully healed, but we were taking steps toward each other. Toward something that felt like hope. A week after our anniversary dinner, I was still holding on to the hope that things were getting better. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and the next one came in the form of an unexpected visitor. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was out running errands when my phone buzzed with a text from Kimmy. There were only 2 words on the screen: "He's here." My heart dropped. I knew exactly who she meant. I rushed home, my mind racing. Why the hell was he at our house? What could he possibly want now? After everything we had gone through to block him out of our lives, why was he showing up on our doorstep? When I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking with a mix of anger and fear. I stormed up to the front door and flung it open, ready to confront this guy once and for all. And there he was, standing in the living room, a smug look on his face. Kimmy was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest. Looking furious but also scared. "What the hell are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. He turned to face me, that infuriating smirk never leaving his face. "Just came to talk," he said casually, as if this were some normal social visit. "There's nothing to talk about," I shot back, taking a step toward him. "You're not welcome here. You need to leave. Now." Kimmy moved to my side, her hand brushing against my arm. "I didn't invite him," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He just showed up." "I'm sure she didn't," the guy said, his tone mocking. "But I thought I'd stop by and see how things were going. You know, check in on the happy couple." My blood was boiling. The audacity of this guy, to show up here after everything, to act like he had any right to be in our lives. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the rage that was threatening to spill over. "There's nothing for you here," I said, my voice cold and firm. "You need to leave before this gets ugly." He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, no need to get violent. I'm just saying if Kimmy ever changes her mind." That was it. I lunged at him before I even realized what I was doing, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. He barely had time to react, and I could see the flash of surprise in his eyes. "You listen to me," I growled, my face inches from his. "If you ever come near my wife again, if you ever contact her, or show up at this house, I swear to God I'll make sure you regret it." The smug look had vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of fear. All right, he muttered, his hands coming up in surrender again. "I'll go." I released him, shoving him toward the door. He stumbled, straightening himself up before turning to leave, throwing one last glance at Kimmy before walking out without another word. The door slammed behind him, and the house fell into an uneasy silence. I turned to Kimmy, my heart still racing, but her expression was unreadable. For a long moment, we just stood there, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on both of us. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know he'd show up." I didn't. I pulled her into my arms before she could finish, holding her tight, feeling her shake against me. "It's not your fault," I murmured, my anger melting away as I focused on the woman I loved. "It's not your fault." But as I held her, I knew that this was more than just another confrontation. It was a turning point. A reminder that we still had a long road ahead, filled with challenges we hadn't even anticipated. We had survived this one, but I couldn't help but wonder, how many more would we face? The days after the confrontation passed in a blur, but something had shifted between Kimmy and me. That unwelcome visitor had shattered whatever fragile piece we were clinging to, forcing us to confront the truth of our situation. We couldn't keep pretending everything was on the mend. We couldn't ignore the reality that there were still deep, unresolved issues lurking just beneath the surface. The evening after the confrontation, I sat down with Kimmy in the living room. I knew this conversation was going to be hard, but it was necessary. We had come too far to avoid the truth any longer. "We need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. The TV was off, the house was still. It was just us, no distractions, no excuses. Kimmy sat across from me, looking tired and worn out. The last few days had taken their toll on both of us. "I know," she replied softly, her voice laced with resignation. I've been thinking about it too. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. I can't keep doing this if we don't face what's really going on. This isn't just about that guy showing up. It's about us. About the fact that we haven't truly dealt with what happened. We're trying to move forward, but there's still something holding us back. Kimmy looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her wedding ring. I don't know how to fix it, she whispered. I've tried, John. I've tried so hard to make things right between us, but no matter what we do, it feels like we're stuck. Her words hit me hard because I knew she was right. We had been going through the motions, trying to patch things up, but we hadn't fully confronted the betrayal that had torn us apart in the first place. It was like we were trying to build a house on a foundation that was still cracked. I don't want to pretend anymore, I said, my voice firm. We can't just sweep this under the rug and hope it goes away. We have to face it. All of it. Kimmy looked up at me, her eyes full of pain and uncertainty. What do you mean? What are you saying? I'm saying we need to talk about everything, I replied. The affair, the lies, the hurt. We need to lay it all out there, no more hiding, no more pretending we're fine. If we don't deal with this now, we'll never get past it. She flinched at the word affair. And for a moment, I thought she might shut down. But then, slowly, she nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. You're right, she said quietly. We haven't really talked about it. I've been so afraid of losing you that I've just avoided it. I didn't want to hurt you anymore. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Kimmy, I need to hear it. I need to understand why it happened. I can't keep wondering if I'll ever be able to trust you again. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes. I don't know how to explain it, she began, her voice shaky. It wasn't about you, John. It wasn't because I didn't love you or because I wanted to hurt you. I was lost. I felt disconnected, like we weren't us anymore. And then, when I met him, it felt like he saw me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It was stupid and selfish, but in that moment, it felt like I was escaping everything I didn't want to face. Her words stung, but I needed to hear them. I needed to understand the root of it all. And what about now? I asked, my voice tight. Do you still feel that way? Disconnected? She shook her head, tears falling freely now. No, not anymore. I see what I did, how I broke us, and I hate myself for it. I've spent every day trying to figure out how to fix it, but I know that no matter what I do, I can't undo the damage. I just want you to know that I regret it more than anything. I never wanted to hurt you like this. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the weight of her confession hanging heavy in the air. Part of me wanted to scream, to yell at her for what she had done, but the other part, the part that still loved her, knew that wasn't the answer. Anger hadn't gotten us anywhere before. It wasn't going to help now. I've been holding onto a lot of anger, I admitted, my voice low. I thought maybe if I could just keep that fire going, it would protect me from getting hurt again. But I don't want to live like that. I don't want us to live like that. Kimmy nodded, her tears falling silently. I don't either. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust you again, I said honestly. But I'm willing to try. If you are. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. I am. I'll do whatever it takes, John. I'll keep fighting for us. I stood up and walked over to her, pulling her into my arms. She sobbed against my chest, her body shaking with the weight of everything we had been through. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't pull away. I held her close, feeling the fragility of our relationship but also the strength we had found in trying to rebuild. I don't know what the future holds, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. But I know I still love you. And that's a start. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, letting the silence speak for us. There were still so many wounds to heal, and so many questions left unanswered, but we had finally taken the first real step toward facing them. No more hiding, no more running. It was time to reckon with the past and decide if we could still have a future. It wasn't going to be easy. Nothing about this had been. But as I stood there, holding Kimmy in my arms, I realized something important: we were still here. Still standing, still trying. And that was something. Maybe, just maybe, it was enough.